Good afternoon, and thanks to each of you for joining us today. I'm Victoria Bell, and I am on the K-12 education team at the Philanthropy Roundtable. We have an all-star panel lined up, and I'm eager to dive in. I'd like to start by reminding everyone that the vision of the Roundtable is to build and sustain a vibrant American philanthropic movement that strengthens our free society. To achieve this vision, our mission is to foster excellence in philanthropy, protect philanthropic freedom, and help donors advance liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. Our discussion today is critical to advancing this effort. Last week, the most significant school choice decision in recent history was handed down by the Supreme Court. On June 30th, SCOTUS ruled in Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue that it is unconstitutional to exclude parents from choosing religious schools in private educational choice programs. In our time today, we have three goals, namely, to explain the ruling and the circumstances that led to this decision, to discuss the implications for education reform, specifically school choice moving forward, and to suggest how philanthropy can make the most of this moment to expand educational opportunity across the country. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick poll of the group, and in a moment you should see it pop up on your screen, and you'll have about 15 seconds to respond to the question. Great. So based on the poll results, it looks like most of you have a good understanding of the Blaine amendments. And on that note, I'm pleased to introduce each of our panelists. So Tim Keller is a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice. Tim has litigated school choice cases in federal and state courts for almost 20 years. He leads IJ's educational choice team, and he and his team help policymakers design constitutionally defensible educational choice programs. And he and his team help defend these programs in courtrooms nationwide. Tim and his wife, Lisa, have 4 sons, and he spends his free time taking care of his family and reading a book a week. Cara Candal is the Director of Educational Opportunity for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, where she leads policy work on private school choice. Cara has worked in the field of education policy for more than 15 years, researching and writing about private school choice and charter schools. Gerard Robinson is Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation, located in Charlottesville, Virginia. He is a researcher in the areas of public policy, parental choice, and politics. And finally, Darla Romfo is the president of the Children's Scholarship Fund, which administers over 7,000 privately funded scholarships in the New York City area, and also 500 scholarships in New Hampshire through the Tax Credit Scholarship Program. They also partner with 26 different scholarship granting organizations to provide an impressive 26,000 scholarships across the nation. And since 1998, they and their partners have helped nearly 200,000 children in America access the schools that best fit their needs. A bit of housekeeping: if you have questions you would like to ask the panelists, you may submit those at any point throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature, not the chat box, and we will address your questions at the end. So to kick us off, Tim, I'd like to turn it over to you. Could you start by explaining the Espinoza ruling and the circumstances that led to this decision?
Absolutely. So let me begin almost 20 years ago. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, ruled that under the U.S. Constitution, states that create school choice programs could include religious options for the families who participate. But that court left open an important question, and that question was, what would happen if a state decided to exclude religious options from educational choice programs. And in fact, it was that lack of an answer that was one of the reasons why we didn't see such a huge explosion of school choice after the Zelman decisions, like so many people expected. The opponents of educational choice shortly after that decision in Zelman said, we are going to abandon the federal constitution and we're going to turn to state constitutions as a means of preventing the enactment of school choice programs. And their favorite tool by far and large was state Blaine amendments. This was how we began the afternoon with your poll. So what is a state Blaine amendment? Well, Blaine amendments derived their name from a man by the name of James G. Blaine. He served as a senator from the state of Maine, and he served in the late 19th century, and he had his eyes and desires set on the US presidency. He wanted to be president, and the vehicle which he chose to try and ride to the White House was a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment. At the time he was serving, our nation's public schools at that time were overwhelmingly Protestant in orientation, and there was also a huge wave and influx of Catholic immigrants into the country who started demanding a share of the public school funds. Their argument was that if the Protestants have their public schools, we ought to have our own publicly funded Catholic schools. And this perceived Catholic menace led to a proposed amendment to the US Constitution by Senator Blaine that would have prohibited states from making appropriations in aid of sectarian schools. And it was an open secret that word sectarian was code for Catholic. While Senator Blaine failed to amend the US Constitution, nevertheless, that sort of language found its way into 37 state constitutions nationwide. And our opponents of school choice have grasped onto that language to challenge school choice programs and to argue in state legislatures that programs cannot be enacted because the way they view the world, school choice programs aid sectarian schools. And of course, they don't distinguish between Catholic and other religions. They just use that word sectarian as a synonym for religious education, period. So that's what a Blaine Amendment is. That's the short version. If you want the full version, you can read Justice Samuel Alito's concurrence in Espinoza, which was a remarkable and wonderful vindication of everything that IJ has been saying about Blaine Amendments for the past 20 plus years. But let me tell you how Espinoza arose specifically. So in 2015, the state of Montana adopted a scholarship tax credit program, a really modest program that incentivized donors to give money to nonprofit scholarship granting organizations. And in return for those donations, they were able to take a dollar-for-dollar tax credit, only up to $150. That program, once it was adopted, resulted in the Montana Department of Revenue adopting a rule to exclude families from that program if they chose to use their scholarships at a religious school. And they justified that rule, that exclusion of religious families from the program, on Montana's Blaine Amendment. So the Institute for Justice actually filed a lawsuit on behalf of 3 families, including 2 single moms, who had applied for the program and wanted to use their scholarships to attend a small private Christian school in Kalispell, Montana, called Stillwater Christian. They were not able to use their scholarships at that school because of the rule. And we originally won in the trial court, but when we got up to the Montana Supreme Court, a very surprising thing happened. The Montana Supreme Court agreed with IJ that the rule was illegal because the Department of Revenue had essentially amended a duly enacted state statute, which we thought would have ended the case. But the court went on and said, no, because without the rule, the program allows families to choose religious schools. And in the court's view, that meant the state had enacted and was authorizing a program that would aid sectarian schools. And so the court said that would be unconstitutional under Montana's Blaine Amendment. They then looked at the state statute and said there's no way for us to simply sever religious schools from the program. And so the Montana Supreme Court struck down the entire program simply because it included religious educational options. So that was IJ's cue to take this case back up to the US Supreme Court and try to have this lingering remaining question that was left open after Zellman answered, which was, could a state block the enactment of a choice program simply because families choose religious educational options? And thankfully, last week, the US Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, said no. He said that while a state does not have to enact a private school choice program, if it does, it cannot discriminate against religious educational options within that program. And a state court can't justify striking down the program simply because religious families can choose those religious educational options. It was a wonderful ruling. We have heard objections that somehow that this particular opinion has eroded or breached the so-called wall of separation of church and state. But in fact, what this decision does is it really vindicates important constitutional provisions, both for religious liberty and for parental liberty. What this decision does is it ensures that the government itself cannot discriminate against religious individuals when they participate in an otherwise generally available government benefit program. So it means that a family receives a scholarship, they can choose a religious school, and the government has to remain completely neutral with regard to religion, neither favoring one religion over another, nor favoring non-religion over religion. And it also is a vindication for parental liberty, because for well over 100 years, the US Supreme Court has recognized that the Constitution protects every parent's right to direct the education and upbringing of their own children. And this ensures that if a parent is going to participate in a scholarship program, that they have the right to choose the school that they believe is best going to meet their child's unique educational needs. Now, the great thing is about this ruling is that it is both very broad and it's also narrow. So let me tell you how it's broad. It is broad because it applies to all 50 states, regardless of whether or not they have a Blaine Amendment. If the state enacts a school choice program and gives families the ability to choose a private or public school or a private school, they cannot eliminate religious educational options. And really that would probably apply outside the context of school choice programs as well. So if they had a state Medicare program or something along those lines, they couldn't exclude religious hospitals, for example, from a program like that. And so that's great. And so it's going to have some immediate impact in a handful of states. There are 3 states, Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, which all operate private choice programs that currently exclude religious schools. It may take litigation. We may have to sue those states in order to open those up for families who would prefer to use their benefits at religious schools. But that's really great news. And it's also broad in the sense that it should open up options in state legislatures and eliminate the legal barriers to choice, even though it hasn't removed political obstacles. But in virtually every single state, it has removed the biggest legal impediment to school choice that there has been. Now, it's narrow in another respect. It's narrow in the sense that what it prohibits is discrimination on the basis of religion. It doesn't extend to states that differentiate between aid to public and aid to private institutions. So there are a small handful of states that have constitutional provisions that resemble traditional state Blaine amendments, but instead of talking about no aid to sectarian schools, they talk about no aid to non-public schools, period, end of story. And so the Espinoza decision doesn't necessarily reach into those particular places. And so those states are Michigan and Massachusetts, which have very broad prohibitions on any sort of government program that would aid non-public schools. So the reasoning in Espinoza doesn't have a big effect there. There are also a handful of states that would distinguish the use of public dollars to aid non-public schools and specifically limit it to public dollars. So it's possible that in that handful of states, tax credit scholarship programs could still be an option, states like Hawaii and Alaska. And then the last thing about the decision that I'll mention, I know I'm running out of time, Victoria, but it does leave open a couple of questions. And so there is going to be some cleanup litigation that is going to happen. As my friend and mentor is fond of saying, this is Clint Bolick, one of IJ's co-founders. He says that if Star Wars teaches us anything, it's that the Empire always strikes back. And so we are, of course, going to see continued opposition to the enactment of school choice programs in state legislatures, but we're also going to see them try and use a small, narrow legal argument that the Chief Justice left open in the Espinoza decision, because he rooted his decision in what he called a status-based discrimination. So he said you cannot discriminate against religious schools solely because they are religious. But he left open the door to possible arguments that states could exclude certain categories of instruction, such as religious worship or religious teachings of particular religious doctrines. Now, even while doing that, he really shut the door on that almost entirely by saying any such amendments would be subject to strict scrutiny, and he rejected as a compelling governmental interest any desire to have a broader separation of church and state under a state constitution than is required by the federal constitution. And he ticked off a number of factors that a state would have to meet in order to accomplish that sort of religious discrimination. And he said you can't use religious use as a proxy for status-based discrimination. But nevertheless, the Chief Justice is an incrementalist. He tends to try and write narrow decisions. He did leave that door open. And so we'll see what opponents of educational choice try to slip in that very narrow door in the future. But if we can drive those issues back up to the U.S. Supreme Court quickly, then I fully believe that we will have fully and completely buried James Blaine's legacy, and we won't have to worry about Blaine amendments ever again as an obstacle to educational choice programs.
Thanks so much, Tim. I know, IJ, you and your team have put together an impressive 50-state analysis, and when I send my follow-up note, I'll make sure to include a link to that. But wanted to make a plug there for your analysis, and also wanted to transition the conversation to thinking about some of those state policy implications. So Cara, I want to bring you in at this point. There may be some on the call who aren't familiar with tax credit scholarship programs. So could you maybe talk a little bit about what those are, what states have them, how they operate in light of this decision?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Tori. I can talk about tax credit scholarships as well as some of the other, I think, private school choice mechanisms that that will become, maybe will have momentum in some additional states going forward. But a tax credit scholarship, just very generally speaking, the tax credit is the mechanism. So this is when states provide either corporations or individuals and corporations, what we like to see is a dollar for dollar tax credit, because it results in more funding. But they provide those individuals or corporations for tax credits in exchange for donations to scholarship granting organizations. And then those scholarship granting organizations make donations to families, to children who want to take their scholarships to usually a participating private school. And by participating, I just mean private schools that meet minimum basic requirements for safety, among other things. Different states have different rules. But tax credit scholarships are currently operating in 22 states. It sort of depends on whose count you look at, but at Excel and Ed we go with 22. In 22 states, and some of those states, in fact, have Blaine amendments. So while Blaine has been an impediment in some states, other states have found their way around it. So the largest tax credit scholarship, Florida, for example, is in Florida. And that is currently serving, I believe, over 18,000, almost 20,000 students. And Florida, of course, has a very robust environment for school choice, generally speaking. But Florida's tax credit scholarship is in many ways a model, but we see many great tax credit scholarship programs across the country. Some other forms of school choice, though, that I think we need to mention, that although the Montana case directly addressed tax credit scholarships, according even to IJ's own analysis, in some places this will open up just the door for more private school choice in general. So another form of school choice, the oldest form of private school choice that people might be familiar with, is a voucher. And a voucher is when state and local dollars basically are assigned to children instead of to schools or to districts. And then those children, those families can take those monies to schools of choice. Now, the vast majority, the very vast majority of all private school choice programs in this country, whether they're funded through a tax credit scholarship or through government funds, are means tested, meaning that children have to qualify, usually either with regard to income, or sometimes we have programs that exist for certain categories of students, such as students with disabilities. Tax credit scholarships have grown in popularity in the past 10 years. So we see a lot more of those programs than we do of other programs. And we do vouchers, for example, or the next form of school choice, private school choice, which is what we call an education scholarship account, or some call an education savings account. And this is yet one more mechanism. It could be funded through a tax credit, as some states would like to do. In many cases, ESAs, as we want to call them, well, I say many, but there are currently only 5 ESAs that are operating, that are in operation. 2 are in limbo. But these programs can be funded with state dollars or through a tax credit. And the idea here is that it's a jointly managed account, both managed by the state or state agency, an administering agency, and the parent. And the parent can take this money to be used for a variety of purposes, including private school tuition. In many cases, states allow things like the use of these monies for things like educational therapies, for things like accessing early college courses, fees for tests, AP classes, all of these sort of things that you can imagine wealthier families tend to have easier access to, and families that do not have the means are often shut out of such opportunities. So education savings accounts or scholarships accounts are a very sort of flexible way of doing private school choice, and they're very customizable. And again, they could be funded in a variety of ways, including through a tax credit. That's one way of doing it. I'd like to take a moment just to speak about not only this moment that we have in this post-Espinoza moment, but also just where the country is generally and how I think that impacts the desire for more flexibility in education and the desire for private school choice. So I'm betting that a lot of you listening to this right now are parents and have been living through this rather interesting moment in the education of your children. I know I am a mother of 3, working full-time, my husband's working full-time, and we've all been balancing some very interesting stuff. And I think even those of us who have the luxury of being able to choose the school that our child attends, whether we choose a public school based on where we live, we vote with our feet, or whether we can afford on our own to pay private school tuition in the absence of a private school choice program, some of us, data show, are pretty disappointed with what our schools have been delivering to us, whether they are district schools or private schools or any of the above. And I think that what I'm seeing as we look at states and what's happening right now is just this huge desire for flexibility. And I mean, cutting across governance structures. So I'm going to use Arizona as an example. I know one of our panelists is in Arizona, and some of you might be in Arizona, but this is a very robust school choice environment. So, right, Arizona, the home of the first education savings account, many other private school choice programs. But some of the stories we've been hearing out of Arizona is that parents are sort of so used to choice that they are in this COVID moment, if they're dissatisfied with the online education that, let's just as an example, that their public school district is providing, that they've been sort of moving over to, say, a local charter school that might have an online program that they like. And now, because that school is not operating with the constraints of a building, they're able to serve more students. And so we're sort of seeing parents of all backgrounds trying to cobble together these educational experiences for students, very much in the spirit of an education savings account. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that not all parents who are doing this are beneficiaries of education scholarships account. And this causes a huge problem, a huge question of, well, how do we fund students in such an environment where parents want a little bit of this or a little bit of that? And I think what the answer goes back to when we think about policy is, well, it's about funding students and families instead of funding institutions, or instead of directly funding schools or districts, or thinking in terms of governance structures. And so that's one really interesting thing that I think private school choice can lead us to think about. So what are the different ways in which we can think about funding families, funding kids going forward. And I'll also say that we're seeing some interesting momentum just even at the federal level in terms of states applying for what the Federal Department of Education is these Rethink K-12 education models. And one of these federal grants under one of the uses, states can apply to, for example, provide what they're calling micro grants to families so that they can have small amounts of money to use for things like technology, for accessing online learning or course access programs, among other things. So I think that this Espinoza decision, which is on the side of right and which is just, something that we've all been fighting for so long, combined with this moment in which even parents who have always had the luxury of choice are realizing that maybe they don't like all of their choices, is putting us in a place where states are really beginning to rethink their policies and really beginning to rethink in a meaningful way what kind of flexibilities parents and kids need to access the kind of education that they want. And that can mean something different for each parent. The one other thing I'd like to point out about the current moment, and I believe Darla is going to speak to this a little bit, is that we're very worried right now about the demise, for example, of some of this nation's Catholic schools and other private institutions, private school institutions that serve very large numbers of low-income students. Those students will be pushed out of their schools if these schools close, and many of them are closing. Or they may no longer be able to afford, for example, the schools may no longer be able to afford large sums of financial aid for families that can't afford to pay. This causes, not only is it a great cost to school districts as students flow back into the system because they don't have private schools, but it's a loss. It's a loss for our country, and it's a loss to these families that have long been served by Catholic and other schools. What we are seeing in states with robust private school choice programs, and certainly we're seeing this in Florida, is that when you have private school choice programs like tax credit scholarships at scale, states need to invest in those schools, need to help those schools stay afloat, because it's no longer about the schools, it's about the families, it's about the kids. And certainly that's something that we're watching as a means of preventing more school closures across the country. We're going to be watching places with private school choice programs.
Thanks so much, Cara. That was really helpful. Gerard, you have multiple experiences that inform your perspective on education in America. And reflecting on those experiences, talk to us a bit about Blaine amendments. Do you think they have limited progress in education? What do you think the path forward is? Other factors at play? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. So thank you, Victoria, for the introduction. And let me say welcome to everybody who is on this call. And here's why. When I see Espinoza, I think a great deal about philanthropy, because it was as much a victory for families as it is philanthropy. The word itself means the love of people. And it would be impossible to have this conversation today without the work of philanthropy. And three people come to mind to me. One is Dr. Jeanette Mitchell, who at one time was with the Helen Bader Foundation and was an early investor as a philanthropist in this work. I think of Patrick Rooney, Golden Rule Insurance, the role that he played. And I think of John Walton from the Walton Family Foundation. As early as the 1980s, they were visionaries, thinking ahead, saying, what role can philanthropy play in opening up the opportunity for what we call today parental choice? And in this sector, we're talking about the private school sector. Their sector was also inclusive of public. And so you fast forward to today, and what my colleagues have said, and the question posed to me by Victoria is very important. What's the landscape for Espinoza? And I'm going to answer that in a couple of ways based upon personal experience. In 2005, 2004, I lived in Milwaukee, and I was working for the Institute for Transformation of Learning at Marquette with Dr. Howard Fuller. And it was at a time where, at the time, the country's first urban-based voucher program, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, was getting ready to reach a ceiling. And it was going to reach 15,000. And according to the law, once you hit 15,000 or 10% of the student population, the program would end. And so a number of us came together and said, well, what can we do to raise the cap? Some people said we've got to change people's voting patterns. That's true. We had a legislative proposal. We've got to work with the governor. We did that as well. And then some said we've also got to work with the business community. And it was the Milwaukee Chamber of Commerce, for example, county, who had several business leaders from Fortune 500 companies to smaller companies take out a one-page ad and say, here is why the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program matters to this city, because it's going to help our talent pipeline. They put it in the broader context of what it meant for a city and what it meant for an economy. But then there was something that I overlooked initially, but when I saw the power of it, it made a lot of sense. And this is something you as philanthropists can think in. Invest in public campaigns, or what I call public information campaigns. We brought over 300 students from the private schools that we had in Milwaukee, put them on a bus, and we went to Madison. And they stood silently in the rotunda. They were holding signs. Some who were not had their hands folded. A number of lawmakers and reporters naturally would want to talk to me. They figured Gerard's a hired hack. Of course, he's going to say the right thing. So they started talking to students, and they talked to teachers and principals who were present. And a number of them walked away saying, you know what? For the first time, I actually hear a human story to this, not one about a voucher or a transaction of money, not one about a school building, but about real human beings. That actually led to some lawmakers changing their vote, which later raised the cap. But it also established a really good conversation, not only between lawmakers and business makers, but amongst public school and private school leaders who began to realize, as Cara had said earlier, this is really about schools and the idea of learning. For me, this is about lifelong learning. And so one thing that definitely philanthropists can do is to think about investing in public campaigns to educate the entire public, those with children in public schools and private schools, why Espinoza matters. And if you have a Blaine amendment, to have a conversation about that. You know, I've been home as well, like many of you. I'm a dad of 3 daughters. You see 2 behind me. The oldest one is in California. She's working full-time now. What's interesting are the number of people who are saying, for the first time, I want to rethink what education means and the delivery of it. Well, that's going to take a public information campaign. I can tell you right now for a fact that our opponents are already putting together a campaign to say Blaine amendments are going to lead to separate but equal that we've had before Brown v. Board of Education. They've said that in a number of briefs submitted in state and federal courts. They're going to say that the Blaine amendment will drain public schools of all its money. Is that fair to public schools? Well, we have research to prove that's not the case. And they're also going to say, well, these schools are going to lead to more bigotry, more hatred. And we've seen that while in some instances, those are some things that have happened, and leaders at those schools are dealing with that, we know that that's not the natural aspect of what our schools, teachers, and schools will do. And so they have a campaign. I think we need to have a campaign as well, focused on philanthropy for the love of people. So that's one thing we can do. The second thing we can do is to take a broader look at state legislatures. We're going to work through our colleagues on laws that take place within the chambers of government. That's great. We're going to try to elect the right governors or support the governors who think this matters. That's great. When I was an advocate supporting this for nonprofit organizations and as a researcher, I did a lot of that. I would say, metaphorically speaking, was throwing rocks at state departments of education windows saying, you guys need to do more to help our kids. Well, when I had an opportunity to find myself now in a state leadership position in both Virginia and Florida, I realized 2 things. Number one, I was throwing the rock at the wrong window. So that was one problem. But the second is that I focused on the wrong body. The legislature would only meet 30, 60, 90 days, or in some instances twice a year. You know who met monthly and you know who worked daily? People in state departments of education. When I was in Florida and also in Virginia, we met regularly as a board. The state passed the legislation, hooray. Guess what? We as a board and as a Department of Education had to create the rules to put in place to make sense of what happened. We got a lot of things right. There's some things that we had wrong. I wish I can tell you that when we had state board meetings that I would see a lot of advocates, a lot of families, a lot of principals, or philanthropists come and testify to our school board meeting. Very few did. During the legislative session, when it was time for a hearing, a lot of participation. I would recommend to you as philanthropists, use your physical presence to go and attend state boards of education meetings in your state, or to write op-eds if you can't happen to make it to the state capitol, or to watch online, to let them know you're listening. I can tell you for a fact, when we started getting emails and letters from real people who said, listen, here's why I think you should amend the rule or change it, we paid attention to it. And so I think with a philanthropy campaign, the love of people, we also have to look at state departments of education and boards of education, because that's where the shaping of what ex-blame amendments will look like, or trying to change those into different ways. So I think those two things are something philanthropists can look at, and glad to be a part of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Gerard. Darla, I'd like to turn to you now. Given your role at CSF, you have a unique national perspective on this topic. What are you hearing and seeing?
Well, thank you, Tori, and thank you everybody for listening today. It's great to hear from all the other people before me too, and I want to do a shout out to John Walton and Teddy Forsman. I know they would have been thrilled with this decision, and I'm here today because of two people with a vision, and all these kids that have been helped are because of those two people with a vision. So first of all, I'd like to say that this is really, really good news for scholarship granting organizations and for kids, but it's doubly good news because it's coming in the middle of a perfect storm of this pandemic and all the economic upheaval. To put that into context, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what we know is happening with our families. 80% of our families say that they have lost income, about half of it divided between losing a job or losing hours. 20% of them have been affected by the virus. Either they've been sick, somebody's been hospitalized. That's much higher than the rest of the population. And a piece of good news is that our families are 90% satisfied giving excellent or good ratings to the schools that they go to. Yet 80% of them say that they are worried about being able to pay tuition in the upcoming year. On top of that, 2/3 of the 250 schools where we have kids in New York said that they are worried about their financial viability in the future. And just today, New York Archdiocese has announced that they're closing 20 Catholic schools, and Brooklyn and Queens announced that they're closing 6 Catholic schools. That over 4,500 kids are affected by that. So, I know you mentioned earlier about the number of schools that are being closed. Well, Cato's tracking them, and I think as of today, it's like at 106 schools. So this is happening right now. And when I say that Espinoza is a ray of sunshine in the midst of a lot of dark clouds, I'm not kidding. And the decision that happened yesterday too in Our Lady of Guadalupe with regard to religious freedom and the Catholic schools' ability to hire the people that teach religion, those are really, really important things, and we should take heart in them. I'd also say, if I was using a baseball analogy, that Espinoza, for one, it was a home run for the kids of Montana. And it was also a home run for our partner program, ACE. Hopefully they can grow the program now. Maybe they can even get some changes to it to get the per pupil amount larger, the overall size of the program larger. It's also a home run against religious bigotry, which is huge. And it's a great thing for all the programs in the country that are already operating. For scholarship granting organizations like CSF in New York or some of our other partners around the country, I'd say it's more like a single or a double. Even though when I looked at your analysis of New York, it sounds like the Blaine Amendment is just, wow, that should be fairly easy. But we know from going through the process that we have a huge political uphill battle. And as you said, you remove the biggest legal impediment, but the politics are still that progressive Democrats and lots of rural Republicans are not going to have their mind changed by this decision. So it's going to be very hard, but not impossible, and we should never give up. And certainly right now there is wind on our backs. And at this important moment, given what we're seeing happening with the schools closing, given that we do have the wind at our backs, I think that the next piece of legislation, I can't not mention it. Our Cardinal Dolan even mentioned it in his letter that went out today about the schools closing, that unless there's substantial aid in the HEROES Act, that's the stimulus package that's coming through Congress probably at the end of July, that there's going to be more schools in deep trouble. So these changes in school choice laws aren't going to happen fast enough to help a lot of schools that could sink between now and then. And one of the things that would be really important was that if there's any aid to education given in this bill, that 10% of it should go to kids going to private schools, because private schools educate 10% of the public school population. And there's also a longer term solution that's in there, and that's the Education Freedom Scholarship Program, which would allow the tax credits on a federal level to scholarship granting organizations on local level. And many of the people listening on here today probably know their senators and representatives. And Gerard just told us that these people listen when you reach out to them. If you can encourage somebody to support it, or at least not be against it, that would be a huge thing. And I also know, like the American Federation for Children has talked about a grassroots campaign. They're putting together a digital campaign to get people at the grassroots to respond and say that they want these provisions to happen. And I think that it's very encouraging and strengthens the whole position going into this, that the Espinoza case came out the way it did. I think that's a huge bit of wind at our backs, even to get this legislation passed. One other thing I would mention, I'm on the board of something called the Drexel Fund, and they invest in new private schools and school choice states. And one of the things that they look at in making those investments are the per pupil amount and also the overall size of the program, because they don't want to invest in states where you're still going to have to rely substantially on philanthropy once your school's up and running. Right now, there are 5 states, Wisconsin, Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Louisiana, where they would go in and start a new school, because they know that with the per pupil amount and the overall size of the program, that you're not going to have to rely more than 15% on philanthropy to keep your school going generally. There's several other states that have programs that now, with the wind at our backs, we should look at trying to expand those states, get the per pupil amount up, get the overall size of the program, make it bigger. Because a lot of these school choice programs, you can fill empty seats, which is a great thing, but you're not going to attract new and innovative operators and models with the lower amount. So I think that that's something going forward we really need to look at. And of course, I would try, we had a heroic effort in New York a few years ago, so it's a little hard to get ginned up to try it again. But I would say, a lot of states should evaluate what the chances are and go for it. Try to expand school choice in a number of other states as well. People are looking at education differently right now, and there's a lot of bad stuff happening right now, but it's also an opportunity. And one last point I'd just like to make is we're talking about policy, and we're talking about kind of at the in the weeds a little bit, but also at the 30,000 foot level. I can't help but think today in New York City, there's over 4,000 kids that have had their life impacted by these schools closing. So that means that families that have lost income, people have been sick in their families. Now, on top of all that, they're being displaced from their schools. So whatever you're looking at doing out there, there's the long term, there's the short term with trying to get something passed through Congress, but there's also, if you have scholarship granting organizations in your area, there are ways that you can help these families right now. We raised an extra $1 million and gave it out to our families just to try to help as many as we could, give them extra support and extra help, because it's amazing how much these families value this education. They put their rent, then their tuition, and then their groceries in the line of priority for what they would try to pay, because they value this education so much. So I would say give generously for the immediate needs, but also, these longer term things about, I know people like to think of the idea of new school models and operators, and I think it's really important in the short term to try to get something passed through Congress and make sure we get some assistance for these schools. We're going to have a lot more schools closing. And, Diane Ravitch once said, when she was still on the side of supporting school choice, she said, there'll be school choice when the last Catholic school closes its doors. We don't want that to be the case. So Espinoza gives us big reason to hope, and the future can look a lot brighter than what the past is. And I look forward, and I hope that there can be, when I sit in the Drexel meetings and I hear about these innovative operators that come to the forefront and have all kinds of great ideas of schools to start. And in the states with, generous school choice laws, they go and they flourish. There's a lot of interesting and wonderful things happening out there. And right now we're kind of in the middle of a dark cloud, but this is definitely a ray of sunshine. So thank you.
Thanks, Darla. Your perspective is really helpful. And thanks to the other panelists as well for your insightful comments. I'd like to open it up now to audience Q&A. So if you haven't submitted your question through the Q&A feature below, please go ahead and do that now. To start, I'd like to ask the panelists to respond to this question. And I know some of you made suggestions and comments in your remarks, and it would be helpful to reiterate that here. So my question is, how can philanthropy make the most of this school choice win? And what does the sector need from philanthropy to capitalize on this moment in time? So whoever wants to take that first.
Tori, two things that come to my mind, and the first is very simple. I think that philanthropy should support organizations that support parents, that really empower parents to make the choice that they know is best for their child. And that's, as I said repeatedly, that's something that some people really, it's a luxury, and for others that choice has never existed. But secondly, I think as we watch these programs hopefully proliferate, and simply knowing the existing programs as part of my job, support organizations that can help stand these programs up in a way that's seamless, because there are a lot of lessons learned from existing programs. And as we see new programs proliferate, whether it's a tax credit scholarship program or a voucher or an education scholarship account, there are technical, tactical things that need to happen. How does that money get distributed? How do we know who qualifies, and what does eligibility look like? And all of these teeny tiny things, states shouldn't have to reinvent that wheel. We can create a wide network to share those best practices and lessons learned, so that it's seamless transition for families, and that we stand up really high quality private school choice programs.
Yeah, and I would say that, every philanthropist has their own interests and things, their own strengths that they bring to the table. So there's so many different little avenues you can go down here. There's the immediate need. There's trying to change policy. There's investing in new schools. So all of these things, there's on the immediate thing of trying to get something through Congress right now, whatever they can do on that front. Any one of those things would be a great thing to invest in, or all of them, depending if this is your thing and you want to really try to have an impact. And I think you sort of order them based on, we want to have some schools left standing when the dust settles here. So doing something for the immediate is important. And then really now with the wind at your backs here, really make the most of this school choice decision.
Tori, my answer would be to provide and build in flexibility for your grantees. We are living in absolutely unprecedented times, as both Cara and Darla have noted. We're seeing huge shifts in parents' desires and for educational choice and innovative programs and flexibility themselves. And there's just so much occurring now, even as we continue to try and digest Espinoza and what it really means going forward. I think flexibility is going to be crucial. And in fact, we at IJ had to come to some of our long-standing partners to ask for some flexibility with upcoming proposals and with some of our grant reports, because so much of our strategy hinged on the outcome with Espinoza, and we just needed that time to actually wait for the decision to be issued and to really assess it and figure out what we're going to do moving forward. So building in that flexibility for grantees, I think, is going to be tremendously helpful as we move forward in this just really unique moment in time.
And the point I mentioned about public campaigns, I think it's going to be really important when you compare Espinoza and the public response to what happened in 2002 with Zelman. Zelman focused on vouchers primarily in Cleveland, and we were excited to make it happen. But there wasn't a very strong national push by folks on our side of the fence to say, this was a victory not only for private schools, but for families. Well, you know what Espinoza gives us an opportunity to do is to build on that. This is a victory for families, a victory for schools, and a victory for taxpayers. I'm on the board of the largest taxpayer scholarship organization in Georgia. And I can tell you, people still believe that we're taking money away in droves from public schools. Well, 8 years into our work, fewer people say that. That's because we had to say it's private money, voluntarily invested into a scholarship organization which will do thus and so. So I agree with my colleagues, invest in the organizations you have. There's some new entrepreneurs, I'm sure, who will pop up as well, but we've got to own the information highway on this. And I think you as philanthropists should use the term philanthropy for the Love of People campaign.
Thank you all. Tim, the next question I have is directed to you. In your comments, you stated that religious schools in Massachusetts and Michigan are in a different position in terms of benefiting from this decision. Could you explain a bit more about why that was the case and why they have a more of an uphill battle going forward?
So sure. So it's not just religious schools in Michigan and Massachusetts that are not going to be in the same position. It's all private schools. So the Espinoza decision hinged on the fact that the state of Montana and most Blaine amendments nationwide discriminate on the basis of religion. And our opponents have always tried to say you have to exclude religious schools from these programs. But Michigan and Massachusetts both have very unique state constitutional provisions. The Michigan amendment is very broad. It actually says no tax credit programs, no voucher programs, no grant programs, no scholarship programs for any student attending a non-public school. It is just extraordinary in its breadth and scope. And honestly, Massachusetts isn't very far behind it. It also talks about no grants in aid of or for the benefit of students who would attend non-public schools. And we have a decision in Massachusetts from a prior situation where they said tax credits are the equivalent of a grant under the Massachusetts Constitution. So there are just no school choice programs looking at the plain language of either the Michigan or the Massachusetts Constitution that we could, point to as far as Espinoza resolving those concerns. Now, I will say this: if we could find the right vehicle, the right case, it is possible that we could challenge the constitutionality of both the Massachusetts and Michigan Blaine amendments if we can demonstrate that the intent behind them was in fact to discriminate against religion. There's a lot of evidence of this in Michigan, and there's a lot of evidence of it in Massachusetts. We haven't really marshaled all of that evidence, and we haven't thought about how do we actually present an issue to a court that would allow us to attack those provisions as being originally adopted as a means of discriminating against Catholic schools. But it's certainly conceivable and possible. The door is not completely shut there, but there's a lot more to think about, how to bring about a case like that strategically in order to accomplish those goals. And it would be, in all fairness, a big uphill battle.
Thanks, Tim. The next question comes from a couple of funders in states that do not have existing school choice programs. So the question is, where we have no mechanisms in place yet to embrace or fully recognize the benefit of the Espinoza decision, is there anything they can do to move forward the conversation around choice?
I'd be happy to start with that one, Tori. I've been thinking a lot about this in the past couple days. A state like Texas is one that always comes to mind. Each state has its own unique politics and reasons, but with Blaine out of the way, even if the momentum hasn't been there, I think that opening the conversation in a way that is as important as private schools are to school choice, opening the conversation in a way that is broad and that is about, again, empowering students and families. So school choice programs can include public schools, private schools, charter schools, course access, all of these different mechanisms. I think that, to the earlier conversation, we are in a moment where we can really turn education on its head. We shouldn't lose sight of quality by any means. We have to have those controls and ideas about quality in place, but the delivery mechanism, the governance structure shouldn't matter anymore. And I think in states where choice is sort of a knee-jerk reaction that it's a no, to really talk about it less as an either or and more as an all. So this is about all types of schools, all kinds of different educational opportunities for all types of students and families, with preference to those who have been locked out of choice for whatever reason, for the entirety of, for generations, quite frankly. So that would be my answer to that.
Here's where we can take a lesson from the public charter school movement. Minnesota was the first state with a charter law. California, where I lived at the time, was the second state. Most people are unaware that the original law for each state only allowed teachers to create a charter school. It wasn't parents. That began to change later. Because teachers were the ones driving the idea that we want to practice our craft in a new, innovative way, teachers began to talk to teachers across state lines as to why they supported charter schools. Let's move to the conversation where the two states have no mechanism. We're using live stream right now. Between the networks that all four of us have, we can identify enough teachers in states to have conversations with people in your states, other educators, so that educators can talk to educators about why it matters. Parents absolutely matter, families matter, but here's an opportunity for us to use our teachers in unique ways, and it's something that the charter schools started doing in the early part of their movement.
That's great. I want to try and fit in a few of these remaining questions before we're out of time. This one will be two-part. Anyone on the panel can address this question. How would you consider the Espinoza decision to impact a federal education tax credit? And then also, are there organizations proposing model legislation following this decision?
So the federal tax credit was already a constitutional vehicle for providing for choice under Zellman, and Espinoza just reaffirms the fact that if a tax credit like that were to be passed, they couldn't eliminate or discriminate religious options for families in the context of that program. So it just really ensures that they have to treat both religious and non-religious options alike should a program like that pass. And then with regard to model legislation, yes, there is model legislation. The Institute for Justice has 2 model bills up on its website, one for a publicly funded education savings account program, one for a tax credit funded education savings account program. The Cato Institute also has a terrific model bill that would be like a multi-use tax credit scholarship program. And there are also several model voucher bills that ALEC has looked at in the past. They're all publicly available and ready to go. And they were all designed and written with ultimately an Espinoza-like decision in mind. Now that we have the Espinoza decision, they're all ready to hand to a legislator and get those bills written and drafted. But in the context of that, always run it by the Institute for Justice or somebody to just make sure that there are no other picayune state constitutional provisions or other issues that might be in place. And we are happy to look at every bill that's introduced in the nation.
And Tim and the Institute for Justice have been a huge help in New Hampshire. So thank you for that.
I'll add that at Excel and Ed, we also have model legislation for all the various types of private school choice programs, and that we also, work in various states helping to tailor the legislation to local needs. So that's an area in which we can be helpful as well.
Great. And the last question I'll try and squeak in here is about future legal strategy. So Tim, maybe you could talk about timeline for some of the next school choice cases and thinking through that future legal strategy.
Sure. So the Institute for Justice is already challenging the exclusion of religious schools from Maine's school choice program. We are preparing right now to file challenges to the exclusion of religious schools in Vermont and in New Hampshire, both of which I said have programs that discriminate on the basis of religion. Those will be coming very soon. And then, of course, we will be heading back down to the Montana Supreme Court, briefly at least, I hope. But you never know what sort of hay the Montana Department of Revenue may try to make once we get back down in front of that court. So the timeline is new lawsuits very soon, and potentially vehicles back up to the U.S. Supreme Court to answer that one narrow question that the court left open within the next maybe 3 to 5 years, maybe sooner.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us today and for your thoughtful comments, and also to those who have tuned in for submitting your questions. As we close, I want to reiterate that the Espinoza decision is part of an arc of legal history, and the story isn't over, like Tim mentioned. The fight for liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility must continue, and state policy and legal efforts are tools in our toolkit. So moving forward, states may more zealously pursue the implementation of new and the expansion of existing school choice programs. And as a result of this ruling, Philanthropy has an opportunity to make the most of this moment and help expand educational opportunity across the country. Since we're at time, I will note that we will send a follow-up note with resources that were mentioned on the call, as well as the panelists' contact information, so you can stay in touch and keep the conversation going. Please also take a look at your chat box. You'll see a link to a survey, and we greatly appreciate your feedback about the conversation. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great job, Victoria.
Thanks.